Hey, everybody, welcome back to Meta Perspective, where we go meta on subjects like insight, awakening, reality, consciousness, metaphysics, and what have you. So today we have a special guest, Vince Horn. Welcome, Vince.
Hey, James. Good to be
And
here.
I called you Vince Horn because I know your name is Vince Fakhoury Horn, and I don't know if I'm
That's
pronouncing
really
that
close.
correctly.
I
Okay.
understand. I totally understand. I have the same experience when I pronounce other people's names. I'm not sure. Yeah, Vince Fakhoury Horn, and
Oh, wow. Wow.
Fakhoury's on my grandfather's side. And my grandparents. My mom was born in Kuwait. My grandfather's from Palestine, and just trying to revive my publicly kind of claim that identity and claim my history there because for many years I felt uncomfortable doing so. Being an
Yeah.
Arab in the United States or even part Arab, is not always the safest thing. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to live a little more courageously and own my heritage.
Yeah. Well, that's a cool name, man. I wish. So, how do you say it again? The middle name? Or the last
Fakhoury,
name? Yeah,
but
Bahori. Yeah.
growing up, kids called fucking Ahuri is a good nickname. It's
Yeah.
easy one to it's an easy
Yeah.
one to tease. But
Yeah.
Fakhoury, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
good to be here.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you had the time to come here. It's awesome to talk to you. And you are super well known in the Dharma world. Um, you've done a lot, you've contributed a lot and innovated. Um, I guess you started Buddhist Geeks.
Yeah, I was one of the two principal people that started Buddhist Geeks, and we had a third co-founder that came in for a little bit. And she left. So Ryan
Yeah.
Olkey and I were the primary drivers of the project initially. Yeah.
And did you also have something to do with the Dharma Overground?
Yeah, I helped Daniel start the Dharma Overground. I was kind of like the tech side of the project, and had been kind of a student and friend of his for a number of years prior to that. So I was part of the kind of the people around him that were goading him to do something, and I at the time had the time and resources to help start it. So yeah, I was part of that project too.
Yeah, that's really cool. The Dharma Overground is like almost infamous in in a
It
sense, a
is, isn't
lot
it?
of it is, yeah. So that's really cool. Um, now, what I guess what got you into, where you are today? I mean, how did you get so involved with I guess you can say the Dharma world or the Dharma Overground to the
Hmm.
point where you started all these projects. So where does that begin for you?
It begins in my childhood. I think, like you, I came up with an interest in consciousness. My family, growing up, I lived with my grandparents, my mom, and a number of my other family members all kind of lived almost, and you could say, in like a bit of a family commune situation in western rural North Carolina outside of Asheville. And I had a very non-ordinary childhood experience for that area in that my one of my family members was a channel. She was channeling, and she
Yeah.
ended up channeling some kind of being who was giving teachings to the family. At this point, I was probably 2 or 3 years old, and so my family started meditating and started doing all kinds of interesting stuff. So I kind of came up in that milieu, and so I had a lot of non-ordinary experiences as a young child and got genuinely interested in meditation when I was 13 and started learning from that same family member who was a channeler, and she was a meditator as well. And that kind of kicked it, like that really kicked off my seeking journey. And when I was 19 in college, I had given up meditation for a while, not really, I think, being old enough to kind of fully comprehend the seriousness of
Yeah.
contemplation. And I
Yeah.
got into some territory that I didn't know how to navigate. But at 19, I came back around to it when I was in college and began the serious, dedicated practice. The people I was hanging out with at the time, going to school with, a lot of them were going on Vipassana retreats, going on these 10-day or week-long insight meditation, and Goenka, one of the teachers who's kind of infamous in this scene, 10-day Vipassana retreats. And so I just was like, okay, this is where my peers are going. So this looks like an interesting avenue. I'm going to go do retreat practice. And I was hooked after my first long retreat. I'd met Daniel Ingram prior to that, because one of his, who I know you've had as a guest on the show, and one of he actually went to school nearby where I was in college at NC State University. He was also at UNC Chapel Hill, and I met one of his roommates in this student group that I was part of, called the Self Knowledge Symposium, and he just forwarded us Daniel's, like, an early draft of his PDF version of his book,
Oh, so
Sterling Core
cool.
Teachings.
Yeah.
And so I got a very early version of that. This is probably 2002. And I found it to be really inspiring. It's a very much of a cookbook approach
Yeah.
to Dharma.
Yeah.
And a lot of he has a lot of confidence in what he's saying is possible. And I gravitated to that, to the confidence and to the sort of the rational framework and the clarity of it. And so that became in part part of my kind of, I guess, guide to meditation. And so that's how I got into it. And from that time, it's about 20 years since it's been a central part of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And you end up like meeting and training with Daniel, and it says on your website you also were a student of Kenneth Falk.
hmm Yeah, I did. So I reached out to Daniel and started hounding him over email when I was reading his book, and I had a couple other friends who were doing the same. And I was happy to get a reply back from him, and he more or less, said, don't reach out to me unless you're really serious about this stuff. And I'm like, I am.
Yeah.
He tried to dissuade me from being in contact, and I was like, well, I am serious about this. And so yeah, I was talking to him, working with him for a couple years while he was in. I guess he was finishing up his residency at the time in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was kind of starting to teach, and he'd written this book, but he wasn't really teaching at the time. So he was just a few people who were hounding him. He'd email us,
Yeah.
and eventually he decided he didn't have the time or wasn't really ready at that time to teach, and so he introduced me to his old friend Kenneth Folk, who's kind of like, in a way, a little bit older version of Daniel, like more chilled out, more mellow, and also I just found him to be really a phenomenally good and seasoned teacher. And so I was really appreciative that Daniel made that connection, and I started to work with Kenneth at that point. I think this was 2005, probably four, and and began to, like, share reports with him of how my practice was going, and we talk and regularly, and eventually I met him in person when I was doing a 6-week retreat at the Insight Meditation Society, where he worked at the time as a janitor down in the
Really? Oh, wow. No, I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah, he was working. I'm sorry, in the maintenance department. So he was down in, like, the caves underneath the center,
Yeah.
And so I went down, and before the 6-week retreat, I got to talk to him a couple times for a few hours about practice, and then at the end of the retreat, came back and talked to him again and shared my full report on what had happened. And yeah, I've been working with him and talking to him regularly ever since. He's been a invaluable. Um, I don't want to call him an asset, because he's a lot more than that, but he's
Yeah.
just such a helpful person. So
Yeah. Yeah. I
I'm
was lucky
grateful to
enough
him.
to have an exchange with him lately, and it's really, really cool guy.
Mhm.
Um, Now, actually, this is what's the origin of the pragmatic Dharma movement, if I can call it a movement?
Yeah, I mean, so there may be different perspectives on this, but since we're meta perspective, that's okay, I guess,
We're
here.
going meta.
Yeah, so from my point of view, pragmatic Dharma, the term arose in the milieu of the Dharma overground,
Yeah.
the this non-local, asynchronous text-based community. And I don't remember exactly, who said it first and how it arose, but it was one of those things that just kind of arises
Yeah.
as a natural result of,
Phenomenon. Yeah.
it's a collective inquiry, and then this thing arises. And I believe Kenneth was one of the. I mean, he definitely jumped onto that and started to use that as his banner. And I think it made a lot of sense. The phrase points to that kind of the general approach that both Daniel and Kenneth have taken of, like a just no bullshit approach to meditation, not really leaning on some of the same mythos that a lot of traditional approaches do, really being willing to engage with, on the one hand, in a serious way, the early Buddhist texts and the instructions, but also to not sort of have a orthodox interpretation of those, to be willing to question them.
Yeah.
So that's the Dharma part, is that they're still engaging with these things. It's not like a secular thing, but
Yeah.
the pragmatic part is like how we're engaging with them. It's like, let's actually try these instructions that are described in these early texts and see what happens. And then if what happens isn't what they claim should happen, then maybe we should update the models rather than thinking that we're a failed version of the early texts,
Yeah.
that we're just like these insufficient, not good enough meditators, and
Yeah.
which is a common belief in the Buddhist scene. It's like we can't be nearly as awake as our previous teachers. So we're in this slide of degeneration in the kind of traditional Buddhist model, where like every generation, we get stupider and less
Yeah.
accomplished. And so they took a very different approach, more like the scientific approach of like, well, every generation you get to build on the knowledge of the previous. So actually, you learn things.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of where it arose, and then that kind of became a flag for that Kenneth would fly for his teachings, and I consider myself part of that lineage, in that I'm part of Kenneth's lineage.
So, and when you started learning from like Daniel and Kenneth, were they teaching you like the Mahasi stuff, or was there more kind of things you were learning?
Mahasi stuff, for sure. The noting practices, that was a big one for Daniel. But they're also really interested in concentration practices and
Yeah.
jhanas,
Yeah.
meditative absorptions. I worked with Kenneth a lot on that after I'd had got some traction in the insight practices. It became a lot easier, to learn those techniques, because my mind was
Really?
it was a
Yeah.
little
So
clearer.
yeah, for me it was like the opposite, right? I got
Yeah, it can be.
super, yeah, I don't know why. It's just that's just how I went about it, I guess. I didn't, I wasn't really thinking about back then how much of what I was doing, I was just doing it.
Yeah.
Um, but it was great. So so from there you somewhere in the midst of all that you started Buddhist Geeks. So what was the
Mhm.
impetus for starting Buddhist Geeks?
Yeah. So when I first met Daniel and Kenneth, I was living in North Carolina. I dropped out of school, because I got so interested in the spiritual search that just didn't get what the point was of getting
Yeah.
a degree.
Yeah.
It had nothing. It didn't seem relevant at all to me at the time. So I dropped out to meditate full time. And my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she suggested very wisely to check out this Buddhist university in Boulder, Colorado called Naropa. She showed me an advertisement on the back of this magazine, and she said, "Hey, look, honey, you could meditate and get your degree."
Yeah.
So I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good idea." And I transferred to Naropa. We both moved out to Boulder. This was in 2004. And I'd also been reading at the time integral philosopher named Ken Wilber, his
Yeah.
work, and was very interested in it. So we moved out there. I went to school at Naropa and finished my undergrad. And I also started working for Ken and his Integral
Oh,
Institute.
no way.
So
Wow.
yeah, so I spent 2.5 years working there during really its heyday, when it was really blowing up.
Yeah.
And I left just before it imploded, because I could tell it was coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mentioned those two places because those were two of my big influences. On the one hand, the Buddhist approach that was being taught at Naropa, and then the other hand, the integral approach. And out of working on kind of learning and studying and practicing, at some point I felt the desire to try to explore some of these big meta theoretical ideas in integral philosophy without using those terms and without having to rely on this big giant complex system. And if you've
Yeah.
heard Ken Wilber talk, you know he has to spend almost like a half an hour to an hour just explaining like the basic theoretical
Yeah.
framework before he can say anything. And I found
Yeah.
that it's just like a very interesting, but also very prohibitive in terms of exploring things in the Dharma world. So I wanted to kind of underground explore some of these ideas, and that became the seed for Buddhist Geeks, was to kind of
Oh,
explore integral thinking, but in a Buddhist context without calling it that.
yeah,
And
that's so cool. Yeah.
that's how it started. In 2006, my friend Ryan and I, he was a student also at Naropa, uh, and he was an audio engineer by training, and I had web design skills, and that's what I did at Integral Institute. So we combined that to form a podcast and the website, and had the
Wow.
requisite skills to get something off the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. And Buddhist Geeks, I mean, at one time you guys were doing conferences, and I'm watching videos of your conferences, and you guys have a ton of like excellent materials, man. So,
Yeah.
thank
Thank
you
you.
for developing all that. That's, I think you guys have definitely uh made a major contribution with that. Um
Thanks.
and so does that, you continue to do workshops and teach, right?
I do, yeah. So at the time that I started Buddhist Geeks, I was not a teacher, but I was, a committed learner, which seems to be the best way to approach podcasting. It's like the people who are really interested in learning and who don't necessarily always consider themselves experts. They seem to produce work that is very accessible to people because they're kind of like letting people in on their journey. Over time, though, I felt like I gained a certain level of expertise and knowledge in my practice. At some point, I remember Daniel like asking me multiple times, like, "When are you going to start teaching?" And I was like, I really feel like I want to be done with the path
Yeah.
before I teach. Like I want to feel like I have and done. Okay, we're going to get into what that means,
Yes, yes,
but
we
I
are.
wanted
We
to
are.
I wanted to feel like I at least understood what Daniel was pointing and Kenneth were pointing to, with their models of enlightenment, and that I felt like confident in my own understanding before I started to teach. And I think I had a very high bar for myself in that
Yeah.
respect. And so I waited until 2010 until I felt confident, that I could teach in a way where I was I was sitting in a deep understanding of what I was teaching rather than being an ego trip, which I'm not saying it wasn't also that when I started teaching, but I was trying for it not to be. And and so that's when I started to teach. And so now, since then, that's been one of my primary, I guess, things I do. And I work with students privately and do all retreat practice and all that kind of stuff. In
Yeah.
addition to running the organization of Buddhist Geeks and doing the tech stuff.
Yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, I saw on your website you had some really cool courses, and I saw, I think one of them had something about integral.
Integral
So
Dharma, yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
so I was like, when I saw that, I was like, I wonder if he's talking about integral theory and all that. And I was like, so that makes perfect sense. That answers that question. And that,
Yeah, there you go.
I think that's a really cool approach, man. It's so interesting to hear from people like you and Daniel and Kenneth, and like you guys have these really awesome backgrounds. It's like pretty deep. But since we're on the subject, what does it mean
Yeah.
to be done? What does it mean to be done? What is, yeah? So like awakening, enlightenment. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed. So what I thought was done, I don't have the same perspective on being done. But I should mention too. So one part of my lineage is this what you're highlighting, that Daniel and Kenneth, the Pragmatic Dharma lineage, going back to Bill Hamilton, and back to the Mahasi tradition in Burma. And the other side of my lineage is really working with teachers in the insight meditation tradition, in particular Jack Cornfield and Trudy Goodman, who they're now married. They weren't when we first started to work with
Oh,
them,
wow.
Emily and
Yeah.
I. But they became also really close teachers of ours. We'd go on long retreats with them, stay in touch with them. Emily and I moved out to Los Angeles for a year just to work with Trudy in person. And so I've gotten, in a way, these two different kind of views of awakening and its significance from these two perspectives, and then add Ken Wilber into the mix, and you've got the meta view of
Yeah.
awakening,
Wow.
which I think is the most kind of conceptually thorough. But my own experience of being quote unquote done relates more to Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk's kind of model of enlightenment. And they probably have a slightly different view on this now, but at the
Yeah.
time it was pretty consistent. They said, in order to be fully done, you have to reach the stage of what traditionally would be called the arhat, the fourth stage of enlightenment, these four stages. And the way they define that is different than the traditional definition. In the traditional definition, an arhat is one who's cut these 10, they call them 10 fetters, these 10
Betters.
things
Yeah.
that kind of keep you latched on to suffering. And they include things like desire and
Yeah.
aversion and self-conceit and attachment
Yeah.
to rites and rituals and things like this. Things that you're like, oh yeah, I'm pretty damn far from that. Like I still feel desire, I still feel aversion, I still forget to, that what I'm doing in any given moment. And so
Yeah.
I certainly wasn't done in terms of the traditional definition, but in terms of Daniel's definition of, and Kenneth's description of really coming to the end of seeking and there being no central reference point to which experience refers, that is something that I felt I had achieved in practice. And achieved isn't even the right word, because it's so much more like, for me, a journey of letting go, of
Yeah.
trying to get somewhere and letting go of my ideas of what I think it is, and just literally being with this moment as it is. And that's something that gradually, and then kind of more and more deeply, it started to kind of, that perception started to come online of just the simple isness of experience. And at certain point, there was a shift in my practice where it didn't feel like that perception could ever be disrupted. It wasn't like I couldn't believe that I wasn't awake, because I can
Yeah.
see this thought, I'm not awake, and feel the feelings and the sensations and the contractions, and I could still have that thought, and it didn't bother me. It's like, okay, fine, that's a thought,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But what this isn't impacted by thinking or feeling or sensing. Like there's something that goes beyond those experiences, but that it's not apart from them either. It's the suchness of experience itself. And no one could convince me otherwise, because it
Yeah.
wasn't something that I learned as an idea. It was something that I knew in the deepest recesses of my being.
Yeah. It was like
So
an insider realization.
yeah, totally. So that was, for me, that was, I'd say that was the beginning of my path.
Yeah.
Uh, and from there, I started to get a bigger view of what awakening was, and started to see, actually, like, well, there's much more to it. Because I can kind of realize that and still be a dick, and
Okay. Yeah.
still have
Yeah.
all kinds of issues, and there's still plenty of stuff I don't know about on the meditative journey, things I struggle with, like metta practice, or other areas that I'm deficient. And so to me, enlightenment kind of opened up from there to become much more multidimensional. One of my teachers, Jack Cornfield, who I mentioned, he has a great article called Enlightenments, and he talks about how all of the great teachers that he met and worked with, some of the the most famous yogis of the 20th century, they all had different ways of describing enlightenment, and by their own definitions, each of the other ones of them would not be enlightened.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet they were just all describing something really interesting and important to him. And so he kind of developed this view that's more of a, I guess you could call a pluralistic view of enlightenment, that it's multidimensional, it's manifold. And to me, that lined up with my experience a whole lot more. It's like, oh yeah, I plumbed the depths of this one facet or dimension of experience, but there's so much more, and it'll be never ending, this process. It
Yeah.
seemingly. So
Yeah.
my view now, it's something like that, but I would say it's not just purely the pluralistic view. I think I've come back around to my early mentor Ken Wilber's kind of description of enlightenment, where he talks about these different axes of enlightenment that
Yeah.
you have. On the one hand, you have like horizontal enlightenment, which describes what we've been talking about, and it's multiple dimensions.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly flat, it's multidimensional on this axis. And then you have a vertical axis, which has more to do with growing up and maturity and your capacity to make meaning of the world, and that we continue to develop that capacity after we're children. As adults, we continue to be able to develop and grow in maturity, and that those two axes are relatively independent of one another. You can be extraordinarily developed as a spiritual practitioner and extraordinarily immature in terms of your sense making,
Yeah.
and that was obvious, just being in the scene. You read enough books, you hear enough stories,
Yeah.
it becomes apparent that like even
Yeah.
the really awake people um can be like very mythical thinking wise. They can, they can not even have the capacity to build rational, coherent models. Sometimes they're just like Ramana Maharshi, just sitting and transmitting silence. But he didn't have a whole lot to say about the structure of like the universe or reality.
Yeah. Yeah. His whole approach was very like, and I get it. I think there is kind of like a beauty in that philosophy. But
Mhm.
again, different flavors for different people, because his whole thing was, um, like, do all his like the description of, say, like cosmology, people are looking for all kind of like the different information, and kind of the nitty gritty. And his approach was like, do you go through your trash when you throw it out? It's like, so you're just going to transcend all that anyways.
Right.
So therefore, don't even
Right.
dig through the trash. Just go there.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, sometimes I think like you need a little of that.
Sure.
Um, but again, sometimes that's just not, the answer, because you can have somebody who hasn't, I don't want to say it like the striving and achieving, but hasn't put the work in, and it's just like, I'm here
Mhm.
now and that's it. And they're kind of on cloud nine, and
Yeah, and they're deluding
you know,
themselves.
right, correct. So there's the
They're
capacity
just
for
hanging
that.
out in some state.
Yeah, yeah. So they don't have to do anything. They're perfect as is. And yeah, that again, there you get to a point where that, to the extent that's delusional, as far as self-deluding unintentionally, likely. And
Yeah.
as you get to see all that in the kind of the Dharma world, or the spiritual, or metaphysical communities. But since we're talking about attainments and all that, what did you think of um like Daniel Ingram coming forward, signing his book, The R Hat, and claiming attainments?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, I really started with his work, and from the very beginning, even in 2002, the early draft of his book, like it was signed the Arhat Daniel Ingram.
Yeah, all the
So
yeah,
for me at the time, it was actually, I didn't have a lot of ideas about arhatship or like the early Buddhist models, but I appreciated that he was owning his understanding and publicly just sharing and communicating what he thought he knew. To me, that was a lot more straightforward and clear than what can happen in a lot of other spiritual circles, where teachers will mostly imply their realization by how they
yeah,
talk, but they won't directly come out and just say it. It's like they're in the closet. They're not like they're in the enlightenment closet, and they won't come out and just say it straight up.
yeah,
There's perhaps scared of the projections that will start flying, and I think that's a valid concern. But by not talking about it, that actually enables that kind of culture of unrealistic projection, and so which Bill Hamilton called the mushroom culture. Put them in the dark and feed them shit, which is a
yeah,
little
yeah.
cynical, I think, but because I don't think that's actually the intention behind these
Right. Yeah.
teachers. I think they're actually trying to, like in the case of Jack and Trudy, I think they were actually trying to formulate a more mature model of awakening that included some of these other dimensions. And they wanted to kind of, in a way, move away from the perfection myths in Buddhism, where Daniel just wanted to, in a sense, reformulate the model and say, this isn't perfection, it's this is what it means.
Yeah.
And so different approaches, but I appreciated that. I appreciated that he talked about it and that he got really clear on what he meant by arhat. And for him, it's like it has to do with the reference point in experience, of having no reference point to which this refers, which itself has a strong basis in the Theravada early Buddhist tradition. I remember coming across this quote from a monk named Mahaboa. He was considered one of the most important 20th century teachers, and he said, if there's a reference point anywhere in experience, that is an agent of birth. And so it's not that there's not a basis for that view in the early tradition. It's just that for Daniel is it, and that's the best way to kind of measure one's awakening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So since we're talking about attainments and
yeah,
arhatship,
yeah.
do you think, and this has become very popular over the last, I don't even know how long, but more recently, the idea of stream entry
Uh-huh.
is like a hot topic, and maybe that's because of the
There's a whole
pragmatic.
Reddit,
Yeah, yeah,
Reddit on this thing,
yeah, subreddit
subreddit.
stream entry.
Hmm.
But I mean, even beyond that, it's really, it's like a phenomenon unto itself nowadays.
Hmm.
So what do you think it is for, like, you think stream entry is doable for most people?
So stream entry, for those that aren't familiar, this would be like the first of the four stages of enlightenment,
Yeah,
and it's considered to be a really important attainment because once you've experienced this from the early Buddhist point of view, you've entered the stream of awakening, and
yeah,
you're entering the stream means you're getting carried by the current. And so
yes,
the idea is, at some point, whether now or several lifetimes from now, but no more than 7
seven,
lifetimes,
yeah, yeah,
traditional lore says, you will be fully awake. You will experience the full fruits of enlightenment, and that's significant, um, because I think it describes some kind of turning point. You could also say neurologically, there's a turning point in the practitioner's experience where they actually have an experience of what it is that they've been seeking for, which is no thing. Um,
yeah,
it's not a particular experience, and that's kind of how you know what it is. Like if you have some profound experience with lights blowing up and angels showing up and the whole universe turning inside and out, like that's not actually stream entry. That's an
rising
earlier
passing, yeah,
stage. Yeah, that's an earlier stage of
changing.
practice, which a lot of people confuse. They get into that stage, they become kind of quite manic, and they oftentimes convince themselves that they're fully enlightened and you
Well,
know
yeah, because
stuff like
I
that.
it's almost like I was going to say a term, but that's probably not a good idea. It's like the beginning, it's like the first step before stream entry, I think, really, in the sense where, like, it's
Yeah.
the point of no return, but it's not the point of no return.
Right, you can still
It's
stall out quite heavily
Yeah, it's like the
after
stream entry
that.
before stream entry, before the true stream entry. It's like maybe the first big step, I think, for most
Yeah,
people, where they
yeah,
have that passing and they know that there's something there. They know that,
yes,
there's a there. So in that sense,
yes.
again, but it could go either way at that point. It's not a true stream entry, but the rising passing is still, I think, very fundamental to people's journeys in a sense.
Yeah, it's really you're right, it's really important, and it's kind of it's initiatory. It's
Yeah,
it's it's
yeah,
a- it's a kind of experience where you get initiated fully into the mystery. It goes from being theoretical to being experiential. It's like, oh
yeah,
yeah, there really is something here,
yeah.
and like you said, there's a there. And so that for that reason it's really important, but it's also really common. It's not that
Right.
uncommon.
Yeah.
People have these experiences outside of meditative context all the
Right.
time, and there's so many things that can trigger it. Giving birth, taking drugs, having sex, watching the sunset.
Yeah.
Like the wind
uh,
breathe, wind
Yeah.
blows in the right way, and
So
you're
out
like,
of body, or
whoa.
out of body experiences and even near death experiences.
Yes, near
Um,
death, psychedelics, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
There's so
um,
many things that can kick that off, that initiation. But then people are really seekers at that point. That's how I feel. It's like then
yes, yeah,
you know there's
exactly.
something there, and you're out to get it.
It's
And
like you're on the ride. Then you're
yeah,
on the
you're on
ride
the
then.
ride. That's right. You're on the ride, and there's no getting off the ride. So I remember, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm getting all my teachers confused. Jack would talk about this in terms of the Thai term for this was pseudo nirvana. So you have
Oh
this
yeah, that's a great.
experience.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a good description. It's like it's kind of like it, but it's not. It's
yeah,
like an echo of what comes later. And I loved Bill Hamilton's description of nirvana. He said nirvana is an experience of the unconditioned, which defies any description. Any
yeah.
description
That's
of
great.
nirvana is not a description of nirvana, and that's the most that can be said about nirvana.
Yeah. Now, yeah, I want to circle back to some questions regarding this, but since you brought up Bill Hamilton, I'm
Mhm.
doing a small project on Bill Hamilton. Do you have any kind of insights or stories or reference points regarding Bill Hamilton? And could you just describe very briefly who he was?
Yeah, so I never met Bill personally. He died before I was really kind of really got deeply into this stuff. I think he died in the late '90s. I was probably graduating high school, at the
Yeah,
time.
1999, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. So I was a sophomore in high school at the time. So I didn't know Bill personally, but I worked with Kenneth, who and Daniel. They both knew Bill, and Kenneth was a very close student of Bill's. He worked with him very closely. Bill, one of the things he's well known for is he founded this thing called Dharma Seed, which was essentially the media arm of the Insight Meditation movement. And he was, at the time, it was all like tape based, so he was recording talks and kind of creating this multimedia archive of all these dharma talks. Eventually that became an online streaming thing, and it's very popular to this day because there's such a huge repository of great talks and teachings on there. So he started Dharma Seed. He was very heavily involved in the Insight Meditation Society, but he wasn't a public teacher. From my understanding, he was kind of an enigmatic and weird dude. And my guess is he was like, he kind of put off the cool kids, in a way, if you want to look at it from like a kind of
Yeah,
sociological perspective.
yeah.
I mean, I remember
So
even talking to Jack about this, and Jack, like the way Jack responded to the name Bill Hamilton, like it told me everything I needed to know, you know.
like how did he respond to like that?
like
That's
like
something
he
I'm
was like he
curious.
was a weirdo.
Yeah.
A little bit, and
Do
he
you think he
was
was?
like he was a weird guy apparently.
Yeah. Do you think that Bill Hamilton was
Eccentric.
like recognized and acknowledged, regarding his, like, as Daniel would say, his capability and understanding of Dharma?
By whom?
Right.
By his students, for sure.
By a student. So what about the like I don't want to say it in this way, but whatever it is, what it is, the IMS click, right? Insight Meditation
Yeah.
Society.
Yeah, no. So see here, I'm walking this tightrope, right? Because, like I said, these are
Both, yeah.
both my
Yeah.
homes, and I empathize with both sides on this. But yeah, no, I don't think he fit the cookie cutter mold of an insight meditation teacher,
Yeah.
and he just didn't have the right, like, I don't know, like, persona or beliefs. He was probably too hardcore in a way, too
Yeah.
traditional.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and he was really interested in enlightenment and the traditional approach. I think he spent 7 years, as I understand it, on silent retreat in
Yeah.
total. So he's a very hardcore committed yogi. All of that I know about Bill came from reading his book Saints and Psychopaths and hearing Kenneth talk about him and share stories.
Yeah.
So that's he's for me, he's like, it's like hearing about my great grandparents or something. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how much of this stuff is true, but it sounds
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah, for sure.
He was also friends with this American Dharma teacher Shinzen Young, who's
Yeah.
become a really important figure inside of the mindfulness movement. And Shinzen, I remember talking to him several years ago, and I think I saw you this quote in your material with Daniel, where Shinzen referred to him as one of the unsung heroes of Western mindfulness.
Yeah.
And you know, I thought that was a really interesting acknowledgement of how Bill had impacted this whole space without really ever being a central figure. He impacted Shinzen a lot, and Shinzen is one of the, most
Top,
important
yeah.
figures in
He's
mindfulness now.
yeah,
And he influenced Daniel and Kenneth, who really ended up also impacting the Dharma and mindfulness scenes in a tremendous way in the last couple of decades. What they've shared has really impacted the mainstream views of these things. And
yeah,
so he's kind of like this. I don't even know how to describe him. He's like this alternate figure that you've never heard of that's having this big impact, but it's like more or less unknown.
yeah,
So yeah, I've got a
yeah,
lot of
and
respect for Bill.
yeah. I recently somebody actually I told them I was doing the Bill Hamilton project thing, so they sent me a audio talk on a website somewhere. As Shinzen Young was doing a talk at or interview at UCLA,
Mm.
and he talked about Bill Hamilton,
Oh, cool.
and essentially he says the same thing, but then he actually goes on to talk about Daniel Ingram and Kenneth Folk. And Shinzen was saying how they stirred the pot that needed to be stirred, and
Yeah.
he gave due acknowledgement. And I have a lot of respect for that. And again, I think
Yeah.
Shinzen is so great, man. He's such a great teacher. I think as far as the way he communicates it, and um, again, I think he brings a really cool approach to it that I think I hope takes on more,
Hmm.
because yeah, it's kind of I don't know. I guess that like the IMS and everything is very traditional, very reserved, very helpful. Um, like I love hearing Joseph Goldstein. The
Hmm.
guy is really just like so thorough, man.
Hmm.
It's like pretty impressive.
Hmm.
But then
He is
again, you have
impressive.
the people like Daniel who just you know communicates it in a different way. And I think
Yeah.
for me, and I don't know if it's generational, right? Like I'm a
Yes.
millennial, so
Yes.
I see where he's coming from, and it really I can really jive with that. It really
Yeah.
makes sense to me, um, that that what he's doing is helpful. Um, so I don't know if it's just like okay, I'm a younger dude, and kind of like it speaks to younger generations,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because
I
I
think
guess
you're right.
because younger generations and I'm not too young, but I'm 34, but
Hmm.
we're all about like screw the taboos. We're just trying to get to the core of the matter. We have the internet and we know what you know what I mean. We're just going to Google or YouTube anything
Hmm.
and find what we're looking for, and
Hmm.
to heck with taboos and the mysterious, you know, kind of things. So it's, not that
Yeah.
it's the right approach, but it seems generationally true. You know,
Yeah.
we just want the answers, like we're gonna Google it. For
Totally.
better
No,
or worse, because
yeah.
you can run into anything at that point. Um,
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a lot of garbage.
yeah,
Um,
there is.
no, I'm with you. I think a lot of it is a generational thing, and you said it too, and a dude thing as well.
Yeah,
Which is not to say that there aren't a lot of women who've been interested in Kenneth and Daniel's approach. It's just to say like they are more unabashedly masculine in their
yeah,
orientation. And one way to understand the whole like Bill Hamilton and the pragmatic Dharma thing over here and the insight meditation thing over here is like it's like yin and yang. There's
yeah.
there's the more masculine approach and this more feminine approach. In a way, that's kind of how I think about it
That's a
sometimes.
great way of putting it. Yeah, yeah, because
Yeah, and then go ahead.
I was gonna say you have like the Daniel and Kenneth, like, dude, we're going for awakening.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
let's
balls to the
just do
wall.
it. Yeah, yes. And the other Insight Meditation Society, I don't know their stuff um well enough to categorize it in kind of like the polar opposite, but yeah, definitely a way different kind of approach,
Yeah.
as well as Bill Hamilton would say. Again, for better or worse, I can't verify this is true or whatever, but Bill Hamilton said to Kenneth Folk, like, IMS is doing psychology,
Hmm.
you know because Kenneth Folk said, how come a lot of the people that go to IMS aren't like awakened or something, and again, maybe I'm taking this slightly out of context, so no judgments
That sounds
here.
right.
And Bill Hamilton said they're not doing insight, they're doing psychology,
Right, right. So
or
that's,
they're
I
not
think,
doing awakening. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Like they're kind of, that is the critique from Bill and folks. It's like, yeah, when people are coming and they're just kind of spinning in their story and trying to do sort of some version of self therapy
Yeah.
versus like transcending the story and
Yeah.
realizing, the whole thing you said about Ramana Maharshi is like, just, you don't want to be rooting through the garbage.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's something to that. If people don't understand the distinction, Ken Wilber would call this between waking up and cleaning up. You know,
Yeah.
um, that like they're different things. On the other hand, I think what Jack and Trudy really taught me is Buddhism is a psychology as well. It's
Yeah.
Buddhist
Yeah.
psychology,
The
and it's
Abhidhamma.
all,
Yeah.
yeah, the Abhidhamma. It's all about the mind. I mean, it really is about
Yeah.
consciousness and the
Yeah.
mind and how it functions, how to work with your mind. So, like, I think that critique, while it's true, it's not true that one can't hold both realities and see the
Right.
difference and incorporate both. And I think that's the downside historically of the pragmatic Dharma approach, is it's so one pointed and focused on awakening and transcendence that it kind of can leave out all these other dimensions, which are quite important as well if you want to live like a good life.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
That's a good way.
Daniel does acknowledge that. Like he says, the first training in Buddhism is the training in morality or ethics. He said that's the first and last training. Like you're never done with that.
Yeah.
Whereas he would claim that you can be done with the training in insight. I don't think that's true, but I do think it's possible to. I don't think it's ever possible to be done in terms of figuring out how to be a better, wiser, more compassionate human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And again, that it's the Eightfold Path, and very similar to the eight limbs of yoga.
Hmm.
The first two, fundamental. I mean, back in the day in yoga, it was considered, before you even get into meditation, before a teacher would take you on, you had to have the first two limbs taken care of, before you were
Hmm.
considered for the deeper meditation samadhi practices.
Right.
Like, you basically had to get your your shit together,
Yeah.
rather than the approach that some people have today. Not everybody, and not that it's wrong, because once you're in it, you're in it. Of
Mm.
that, meditation is going to solve all my problems.
Yeah.
They were coming from the perspective of, solve your stuff first, and then you're going to be ready for the path. So, but again, it's, sometimes people kind of need the path in a sense to kind of, I don't want to say, sometimes it's a good support, I'd say, you know, but there's a lot of, there's no one answer. I think that can go a lot of ways in either scenario.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, sure can.
Um, but man, yeah, there's so much I can talk to you about, man. This is really cool. I saw you, you made a pretty interesting comment on Twitter. And
I try to do that daily.
yeah, well, no, it's fun. It's fun.
It is fun, isn't it? Tweeting. It's
Yeah.
it's
Well,
it's good news, bad news, isn't it?
well, you know what? Maybe I haven't found it, but people are going to know I'm on into the UFO thing, and I have a whole UFO project called Engaging the Phenomenon. And
Yep.
but I was surprised to find out, at least again in my own experience, like the UFO community, in within the UFO community, we kind of look at it like, oh my God, this is like Family Feud. Like, everybody's disagreeing with each other and all this. But we have at least on Twitter, there's a really extensive community of researchers, um, that are constantly. It's like the Dharma overground on Twitter, and we call it UFO
Yeah.
Twitter.
UFO
You know,
Twitter. Huh? Yep.
yeah. But I haven't found that in like the Dharma world. There's no like Dharma Twitter that I'm aware of.
It's not, it's less formalized, but I mean there are certainly a lot of people connected on Twitter in the Dharma world. But yeah, I don't think it's like got a name like that exactly.
Yeah.
It's not the
Well,
same.
I
You're
don't
right.
even, I might be missing out because I mean, the interaction on the UFO thing is like nonstop. Like I can like
Yeah.
look at my phone and there's like 50 new things in like
Yeah.
20 minutes. I'm like, holy crap.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but
It
I
is
haven't,
different. You're right.
yeah, I haven't found that kind of interaction in the Dharma world where people are, I mean, maybe it's just all on the Dharma overground or on like the stream entry subreddits
Hmm.
or something like that, but I haven't found it on Twitter at least. But
Hmm.
anyways, you on Twitter, you said, well-known Buddhists notably are silent on the, UAP UFO issue.
Hmm.
So where are you going with that? I mean, it's pretty
Uh,
straightforward, but
yeah, I just was wanting to make an observation, like just looking around and seeing like who's talking about this stuff in the Buddhist world, with the bombshell, drop the 2017 New York Times
yeah,
articles that, the one after other that came out, and then the recent report, that was released. It's like by the U.S. government acknowledging these things are real, and it's like crickets in the Buddhist world. I don't
yeah,
see any articles being written about that. I don't see people talking about it that much. It's just like a non-event, and that just occurred to me as being very interesting, like something to note. Like, why aren't all of these people who are so interested in consciousness and who are really working out of a tradition that acknowledges non-human intelligence as like a
yes, yeah,
core of its metaphysics, which okay, so part of the issue is that you have a very strong secular Buddhist movement of people who deny that karma and rebirth are even relevant today, so-called Buddhist modernists. So I think that's part of the reason it's not talked about. But still, there are enough people that aren't Buddhist modernists that I would just expect more dialogue within our communities about these things and what the relationship is between what we're doing and what's happening over here. Because to me, there's a very clear Venn diagram overlaps between these communities: the psychedelic community, the UFO community, the Buddhist communities. Like they all intersect around certain issues related to consciousness and to
yeah,
non-ordinary experience. And the fact that so few people are talking about those overlaps is very interesting.
yeah,
And I don't know
yeah,
exactly what to make of that.
yeah. Seriously. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have, Daniel Ingram. He came on Engaging the Phenomenon, and he spoke to it in his perspective, and I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, I mean, I see. I'm not acknowledged in the Dharma world at all. I'm kind of like an outsider in a sense. So I'd love to start that conversation, but I can't really because I'm just some random dude on the internet. But you can. So I really appreciate that you kind of just put it out there as a question. Um,
Yeah.
because yeah, to me it's an important topic. Again, we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about the fundamental layers of reality, right? If this is
Yeah.
objectively a real thing, it's it's surprising that people in the I guess the Dharma world wouldn't be at least interested and say like, where does this fit, right?
Yeah. I
So
mean, there
what?
are some people that are interested, but they are like you said, they're fringe. There are people that are more on the fringes. Folks like Stuart Davis, who runs Artists and Aliens and the
Oh yeah, yeah,
podcast, and
yeah,
he's a longtime Zen practitioner, mutual of mine. And then there's Sean Esberg Hargens, who's also a longtime Buddhist practitioner, but just not a lot of like Buddhist teachers, people who are like considered to be authorities in the space. I don't see them talking about it. I think the Dalai Lama was like one notable like
yeah,
example of someone who was open to talking about it. And there's a great video on YouTube with John E. Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist
yes,
who got
yeah,
real into this, and he talked to the Dalai Lama about his experience or understanding of UFOs. And I don't think the Dalai Lama claimed to have any direct sightings or anything of UFOs or anything like that, but he had a more a kind of more helpful view of how to understand it than the standard materialist view,
yeah,
which is like, from a Buddhist perspective or Tibetan Buddhist especially, you've got these like different realms, these three
yeah,
realms at least, and you've got this kind of normal gross physical realm, and then you've got this more subtle realms of like like form that's not so gross and solid, but it's more open and light and ethereal. And then you have the formless realm, they call the Dharmakaya, and that is this sort of without form.
Yeah.
And that you could understand these phenomena like from that lens. Like you could see, oh, is this actually something that's happening in the gross world? Is it subtle? Is it causal? Like there's an actual like a more sophisticated way to apply that to the phenomenon, to understand it, differently. It's like, is all this stuff, all just objective and gross and measurable in some with equipment? Like not everything that people are reporting is like that. Like some of it's just like really interesting personal experiences and psychic encounters and things like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's not real unless you're a materialist. And I
Yeah.
think one thing the Buddhist tradition, I think, could offer this conversation is just a better metaphysics of kind of how to
Yeah.
work with these things, to let go of the insistence on everything having to be objective, measurable. It's like
Yeah.
that, like everything that's valuable isn't measurable. Like we know
Yeah.
that, you know,
Yeah.
like you can't measure your love for your partner, or your children, or your family, and yet
Yeah.
it's like one of the most important things.
One of the things that's fascinating to me about the UFO subject is it's kind of where the rubber meets the road on physics and metaphysics, because it
Yes.
it it demonstrates both components sometimes simultaneously,
Yes.
where you have somebody has, say, you can say a subjective telepathic or ESP experience, but yet there's this physical object there in the sky that's objectively real. It's gotten pings on the radar. It can be,
Right.
recorded. So to me, it's been fascinating, because obviously people might know I've had some of these experiences, and for me it was, um, I don't want to say it was a catalyst for my whole journey, not whatsoever, but it was, definitely a stepping stone on my path of awakening, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, so but for some people, the phenomenon or the UFO subject can be a catalyst to kind of perceiving a greater reality, which ultimately you're going to end up with the ideas of the path of awakening when you're tackling those subjects.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I
I mean, I
see it
think,
as like, no,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. Well, just the very fact that it's often called the phenomenon, or that we're now using that acronym, like unidentified aerial phenomenon, instead of an unidentified flying object, like
Yeah.
that to me represents a philosophical shift toward recognizing the primacy of experience in working with these things. It's a phenomenon. What do you experience a phenomenon? And a subject experiences phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's phenomenology. It's the study of
Yes. Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate seeing that in the UFO UAP space, of like the opening up to the importance of consciousness too. Like, and I was watching The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch recently, that history series,
Yeah.
and kind of diving into the whole Skinwalker Ranch, which is a physical ranch in Northeast Utah. And it's so interesting to watch like these researchers come in. Most of them are like have a background in like some kind of material science, right? Like
Yeah.
astrophysics and things like that.
Yeah.
And they're coming in and they're doing hardcore scientific method, exploration. They've got all kinds of monitors and recording everything and checking all the, the electromagnetic frequencies. And and there's one episode in the second season I just saw where they bring in a rabbi, to do like this sort of opening of a portal.
Yeah.
And they're open to the possibility that these spiritual teachers could actually know some stuff about this. And of course what happens is like a bunch of crazy shit starts happening when the dude does
Yeah.
his thing.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, what's interesting I noted was, as the rabbi is sitting there doing his thing, like the people that are gathered there are really see him as an instrument. Like he's an
Yeah.
instrument to see if they can trigger this thing that they can measure.
Yeah.
And then so much so that they take a recording of the prayer he did and tried to replicate the experiment the next night. And it's so interesting to me, like the mindset that would both see the possibility that consciousness and the direct working of consciousness with these phenomena could be related to them, but simultaneously is sort of thinking in very materialistic terms. Like you could just take an audio version of what the dude is doing and that somehow is the same, that's actually replicating it. It's not replicating it at all because the guy was
Yeah.
not there, you know?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like it's like an incomplete, it's an unfinished integration still that's
Yeah.
happening in that space. Like materialism is breaking down, but there's still a kind of, to me, like a grasping on to the metaphysics of scientism, you know,
Yeah.
and trying to only understand these things in third person terms, when like the personal and intersubjective dimension of what's happening is actually what convinces these materialists to like be open to the
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Well, and some of this, the new book, Skinwalker at the Pentagon, you
Yes.
know, these some of these, again, like heavy duty scientists, rocket scientists and what have you,
Yeah.
um, are some of the people that are having the experiences,
Yeah.
so they're
And
they're
each and every one of them are converts after they have them, right?
yeah, because I
You
mean
can't deny.
one of them, he gets on the ranch and he sees, and this guy probably priorly is a materialist, and he sees a portal open up and some kind of entity come out of it.
Right.
That's going to change the way that you see reality.
Yeah.
And
And
again, that's why I think,
he's not like tripping on anything that we know of. Like he's not like
yeah,
ingested anything. Like he's just
yeah,
walking around having a cold stone sober experience of fucking portals opening up and entities emerging out
yeah,
of them.
yeah. And so that's what I find so fascinating about the UFO, is that it's a way where the rubber meets the road between physics and metaphysics.
Mm.
And yeah, man, I'd love to have you on Engaging the Phenomenon sometime, just to kick it about
Oh,
UFOs and stuff.
cool. That'd be
Because
fun.
yeah, and actually, you know what? I'm going to take this clip and put this clip on there as well, and
Okay.
because I think it's awesome, man. I love that. You know, I guess I can call you a public figure from the Dharma world, is engaging with maybe me, a UFO researcher, an experiencer, but also the UFO subject at large publicly. I think we need more of that. And that's part of why I'm doing Engage in the Phenomenon, and that's why I'm doing the Meta Perspective podcast. So we can have these engagements instead of kind of like ignoring it. So I
Hmm.
really appreciate you being able to be part of that.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think it's something that we need to talk more about because it's just like it's such a big deal.
Yeah, the
And
implications. Yeah,
the implications are, yeah, I mean, they're earth shattering.
yeah, they literally,
Yeah.
from whether you're talking about a spiritualist or a materialist, a metaphysical standpoint. I think it kind of like breaks down all the barriers between all those worlds,
Hmm.
in some sense. Um, but let's switch gears again, and I just because we're getting towards the end of our talk,
Sure.
unfortunately. It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise.
So let's, for people that are on the path, right? Of, a journey of awakening or mindfulness, meditation, um, what do you think are some of the like roadblocks?
Like the just
Yeah,
common roadblocks that
yeah,
people run into.
yeah. And with that, what is something that they should do to carry on from there?
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, there are so many different roadblocks that people can run into, so it's a little hard to answer in kind of generic terms. I mean, and I run into people that are, I would say, I mostly speak with people that are a little bit further down the road of the path, because the early roadblocks are really kind of what we talked about, like putting enough effort in to see results, like getting sufficiently into the stuff where you actually aren't just thinking about it and talking about it sometimes or doing it occasionally, but you're actually like you're dedicated and you're really like putting effort in and day out, like and you start seeing real results. That's kind of, I think, one of the earliest roadblocks. And then from there, another common roadblock is when people do get some results. Like they get to experience like that stage of practice that we talked about, like pseudo nirvana, where they're like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, there's something here. Often that what comes after that can be quite challenging for folks. Daniel Ingram talks about it in very broad terms as like the dark night phenomena,
Yeah.
you know, and where there's some kind of process. I call it the disillusionment phase, because there's some sense in which you've had some profound experience, but then it's not everything you hoped it would be, and you haven't changed and transformed usually in any significant way.
Yeah.
And you're just like, I have this knowledge of this thing that's important, and I sense the possibilities and intuit the potential, but like I don't fully realize it. And
Yeah.
there's, I think, a great sadness that can come in that gap of knowledge, and in the reorientation to life that kind of happens, when your whole world gets blown apart, and then you don't really know what's true exactly anymore. Like
Yeah.
what do I trust?
Yeah.
And to me, that roadblock there is really, and this is more the roadblock I see people running into, is like letting go of, I call it samsaric logic. You know, this idea, samsara is the idea of continuous rebirth, and you're always stuck
Yeah.
kind of in this loop, this endless loop. Samsaric logic is if this, then that. It's the
Yeah.
basic logic. Like if I do this, then I'll get this. If I do that, then I'll get this. And we sort of think in that conditional trust terms. Like if I practice, then I'll get enlightened. And that's not how it works. The unconditioned, which defies any description, it doesn't arise because you've done something. Like it doesn't work on those same rules
Yeah.
exactly. And so to me, one of the roadblocks is in developing unconditional trust or nirvanic logic. You know, and
Yeah.
samsaric logic is if this, then that. Nirvanic logic is just this,
Yeah.
just that. You know, it's the isness and the thusness of experience. And people have to like learn how to surrender to that, like to trust
Yeah.
in experience itself without any expectation that by doing so they're going to get something. um and that's unconditional trust. And to me, there's a roadblock there of like, you've just got to actually learn how to let go and trust,
Yeah.
fundamentally trust, not like trust in something, but
Yeah.
just trust.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you wake up to the unconditioned. If you do that, then you wake up to the unconditioned. We can't even help but frame it in
Yeah.
samsaric terms, but it's
Yeah.
true that when people stop trying to get somewhere, they get there.
Yeah.
Or Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, an important teacher in the Tibetan tradition, he said, "In the not finding is the finding."
Yeah.
It's like when
Yeah.
you let go and trust, you become it. Like you are it already.
Yeah. Like if you um are kind of embodying unconditional ness, you experience it in a sense.
Yeah, if you just let go and be, you are
Yeah.
it. You know,
Yeah.
but
And
that
in
takes a
one
lot of work, letting go.
yeah, to realize that, to have that
It's true.
realization, you kind of have to go through everything and just say screw all, the hell with all of it, and it just happens.
Yeah,
Um, and one kind of
paradoxical.
like, yeah, yeah, one kind of yogic way I've heard of describing this is in like Kriya Yoga. One of the approaches is like you're not like striving and adding on and becoming. You're removing the obstacles
Mhm.
of
Yes,
getting in the way, that are getting in, that are obstructing the
yes.
innate awakened state. Um, but so it's been great talking with you, Vince. We
Likewise.
definitely got to do this again, man.
Sounds
I
good.
Yeah, you're super cool to talk to, and I feel like you're kind of more in my generational gap or something. Like
Yeah, we're both
you know,
millennials.
yeah, yeah, so that's super awesome. And just for the audience and the people listening, do you have any kind of like words of wisdom or like a parting message or advice?
No, I think if you're listening to something like meta perspective, then obviously you probably already are kind of on this path of growing up, you know, of making sense of the world in more kind of sensible ways, or having access to multiple ways of knowing and being able to kind of move in and out of different ways. You're interested in that, and I think that's so huge. It's so important. And just that there are these other dimensions that we can develop as human beings. We can awaken to. One's capacity to hold multiple perspectives doesn't give one doesn't open up necessarily that unconditional trust of awakening. And so I would say, in my experience, it's really been awesome to at least kind of work with these different dimensions of human flourishing, to wake up, to grow up, to clean up, to do some like therapeutic work, to show up, to like actually go into the world as who you uniquely are and offer your gifts to the world, and I think a lot of these topics can become very self-absorbed because of the nature of consciousness and like the emphasis on phenomenology. And for me, going into my own experience has led out into the world and toward, really more of an emphasis on like, how do I be a useful person, and like, how do I be a decent father, and how do I like, live in a way where I am that's not contributing to some of these global trends, of like literally the ecological, destruction of
Yeah.
our planet, things like that that are really freaking
Yeah.
important. Um, those to me, like don't leave anything out in actuality. It's good to think about it, but actually going in and doing the work is very hard. And
Yeah.
so my suggestion would be to like do the hard work that you need to do, that you don't probably want to do.
Yeah.
Really, there's resistance. It'd be easier to like kind of think about these things than to do it. But it's much more interesting to do both.
Yeah. For sure. So thank you so much for coming on, Vince. Where can
Thank
people
you.
find your work?
I have a personal website, vincehorn.space, and then the organization that you mentioned, Buddhist Geeks, you can find out more there at buddhistgeeks.org.
Yeah, and also for people listening, you also have the Buddhist Geeks YouTube channel.
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel. That's true.
Yeah, and yeah, there's like a
And a
ton of great
podcast.
content on there. Yeah, and the
Thank you.
podcast. Yeah, dude. Yeah, there's like going. I'm going like I see like a video from like 3 years ago, like on I think it was like access concentration. I was like, this is awesome. So
Oh, yeah.
people
Thanks.
listening, go check out all Vince's stuff. And again, thank you so much, Vince, for coming on. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
My pleasure, James. Thank you.
Take care, buddy.
Take care.